Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
Wall Street waits for word of a deal. Welcome to the Wednesday edition, as President Trump says a deal with Iran could come as soon as today that could bring a new order to the Strait of Hormuz. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Kailey, reports say the strait could be split into 3 separate lanes, which could eventually bring tolls.
Yeah, and of course, as we're talking about a deal here, it's not clear that this is going to be a deal between the U.S. and Iran.
Well,
what
that's
seems to be in the offing is a deal between Iran and Oman over control of these different passages, different routes within the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, I'm getting confused. First of all, how you have an inbound lane, an outbound lane.
Right.
I guess there'd be a dual traffic, dual direction lane eventually once it's demined.
Yep.
But the president's been indicating that this is a deal that involves the United States, so it's unclear what we're working on here.
Yeah, and we'll see if we hear more about this from the president himself. He's due to speak in Las Vegas, Nevada later on this afternoon. That's going to be about no tax on tips, but as always, it could very easily veer into other subjects. I would imagine as well the president might take the chance to echo what he posted on True Social today about the winner of the Democratic primary in Michigan, who, of course, we learned today officially is Abdul al-Sayed, who the president describes as a communist. To be clear, he's not one, but he is from the progressive left.
That's true, and doesn't even identify as a Democratic socialist. But yeah, this is a crushing defeat for Haley Stevens, the Democratic congresswoman, establishment candidate, and it was a squeaker.
Yeah.
Kailey, I guess that Emerson poll is an outlier because this is a 1 percentage point margin.
Yeah, this was incredibly close, which points to the work that al-Sayed will have to do if he wants to gain enough support in the general election in November to defeat Republican Mike Rogers. And this is obviously critical for the Democrats' Senate chances. So we'll get into this with Lara Brown, a political scientist, this hour. But we begin, as always, with a check on these markets. And for that, we turn to Charlie Pellet up in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Hi, thank you very much, Kailey and Joe. Indeed, headline to pass along involving Iran. A word from an Iranian news agency. Iran says these new Hormuz routes will be valid for 2 to 4 months. Indeed, headlines coming out. We'll keep you updated as they become available. Right now, we have got oil, West Texas Intermediate and Brent. They are both lower. WTI 74.88 a barrel, down by 1.2%. Barrel of Brent down at 78.96, trading below 79 on Brent, down 0.5%. Oil lower, stocks higher for now. The S&P has been fluctuating. Any advance today will be another record for the S&P. Any gain today for the Dow will be another record as well. Right now, here's where we stand. The S&P up 8 to 77.45, building on yesterday's advance, up by 0.1%. The Dow up 464 now, up 0.9%. Stocks have been wavering near records. NASDAQ down 76, down by 0.3%. NASDAQ 100 index down 0.1%. The SOX, the Philadelphia Semiconductor Stock Exchange Index, right now it is moving lower, little changed on the day, down under 0.1%. The 2-year 4.20%, with the 10-year currently yielding 4.62%, and the 30-year 5.17%. Spot gold up 4% now, 42.39 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude 75 even a barrel, down 1%. Barrel of Brent 79.13, down 0.3%. SpaceX, after earnings, plunging now by 8.5%. The company disclosed higher than expected spending on its AI business. Advanced Micro Devices lower after earnings, down now by 5.7%. Again, recapping here, S&P holding on to a gain, little change. The key takeaway midday right now up by 2 points on the S&P, while West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.1%. Joe and Kailey, that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you very much. And as Charlie mentioned, that headline out of Iranian media that says Iran is saying that the new Hormuz routes will be valid for 2 to 4 months, so only a temporary period of time. Iran also saying that this new deal with Oman will close temporary Hormuz shipping routes. So this is not abundantly clear if this is exclusively a deal between Iran and Oman to open more passageways in the Strait of Hormuz to commercial traffic, or if there is to be some role that the United States will play in this. As you've mentioned, Joe, that is what President Trump suggested. It's just not what we're hearing from the other side.
Well, that's right. When you consider his language of yesterday, talks are moving along very nicely. U.S. and Iran, he said. We'll know in 48 hours. Then Axios says it could come as soon as today. but that is apparently a deal to control traffic in the Strait between Iran and Oman. It is unclear where the U.S. factors in here. Maybe Kate Sullivan can help us out. As we bring you live to the White House right now, Kate is our White House correspondent live on the North Lawn. Can you shed some light on this, Kate? We're waiting for an announcement on an agreement, but with whom?
There are a lot of questions, as you just pointed out, but the president is saying that a deal could be announced as soon as today. Now, this would be a temporary agreement to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. And Axios is saying that it would be a 60-day agreement that would focus on reopening the strait, allowing ships to pass through. As you mentioned, the different lanes, one would be controlled by Oman, another would go on Iran's border. There are still a lot of questions, and this deal would reportedly also look at resuming the ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran. It also would reportedly meet some of Iran's demands and give them greater control over the strait. That's a very critical point because before the U.S. and Israel started this war, this was a completely open international waterway. It was not controlled by any one country. Iran did not have control over the strait like they will reportedly under this new deal. But negotiations are still ongoing. The president is saying that it could come as soon as today, but also saying, as you pointed out, that we'll know more in the next 48 hours. So suggesting that details are still being worked out, the situation is still fluid, negotiations are still ongoing. I think it's also important to note what this deal is not. And it is not a broad, lasting peace agreement. It does not end the war. It's not a nuclear deal with Iran. And on the nuclear point, that point is very important because this is why the president said he started this war with Iran in the first place, to make sure that Iran did not get a nuclear weapon. So this deal is not focused on Iran's nuclear deal, though it could create the conditions to start negotiations on this nuclear deal. But this is very narrowly focused right now on reopening the Strait of Hormuz. And of course, Joe and Kailey, we've seen many times over the last 6 months that a deal has been reached or a deal has been imminent only for talks to fall apart and strikes to resume.
Yep, there is a pattern here of the president projecting and claiming one thing and it not coming to fruition, just as he always, as you were alluding to, Kate, consistently says Iran can never have a nuclear weapon. I would imagine we'll hear much the same from him this evening or this afternoon when he speaks in Nevada. What else are we expecting him to focus on?
That's right. So the president is expected to give remarks in just a few hours in Las Vegas. It's part of this two-day swing in California and Nevada. The White House says that the president is going to focus on the economy and try to and focus on tax policies and trying to draw a contrast between his administration's policies and Democrats. But of course, it's the president, and this speech could end up going any which way. We'll see if we get a deal, some kind of a deal with Iran, and if the president speaks specifically on Iran. But one thing about Las Vegas, I remember I was at the rally a few years ago where the president unveiled this proposal for no tax on tips. It's something that he talks about a lot. Of course, he talks about his tax policies, and I expect to hear more from him touting no tax on tips. But this swing out in the West is really focused, is partly on fundraising and also on shoring up support with voters, with Republicans, people who are feeling a lot of economic anxiety at the moment, really feeling the ripple effects from the war, high gas prices, high grocery prices. So this trip is also focused, of course, on the critical November midterm elections and trying to really boost support ahead of those.
A gallon of gas in the state of Nevada is $4.80, Kate. In California, where the president was last evening and waking up this morning, $5.63 a gallon. We know California is an outlier. The national average, though, is still over $4. Will the president speak to this side of affordability? I know he doesn't like that word, but while he's talking about no tax on tips, gas prices are essentially making that irrelevant because we're putting all of the proceeds in the gas tank.
Absolutely. It's definitely something that is harder and harder for the president and the White House to ignore. The president, when he talks about affordability, he talks about it as a sort of made up thing that the Democrats are focused on in their messaging, while also trying to, we've reported many times over the last several months that the White House is very eager to really shift the focus and focus on affordability. They want to shift the focus away from the war in Iran and try to really hammer home messages on the economy, on trying to make people's lives more affordable and trying to bring prices down and bring inflation down. So we don't have a readout of his speech yet, but there are, of course, the contours of the speech that we can imagine. There's heading into the November midterm elections and the kind of points, we know the kind of points that the White House hopes the president focuses on. We will see whether the president really focuses on that very disciplined economic message out there.
Indeed, we will. All right, Kate Sullivan reporting live from the North Lawn of the White House. Thank you so much. Of course, as we mentioned a few minutes ago, something else we could hear from the president about this evening is the results from the primary in Michigan, the Democratic senatorial primary specifically, which was a very tight race between Abdul El-Sayed and Congresswoman Haley Stevens. In the end, it wasn't necessarily expected to be, and yet it wasn't formally called by most outlets until this morning. As of last night, they were still waiting, and this was their messaging.
We knew that this was going to be a close race, and that's exactly what we've got. A close race.
To all of our supporters here tonight, watching on TV, tomorrow we begin to mend fences. Whatever happens tonight, we have a responsibility to assure that we unite to make sure that Mike Rogers never sees the inside of the U.S. Senate.
President Donald Trump calling Abdul El-Sayed, whose voice you just heard last, the victor in this, a communist loser who hates Jews and Israel, said, as usual, polls were way off on this one. She, referring to Haley Stevens, who he called a socialist in this post, was not expected to do nearly as well as she did. Now the Democrats' crazy policies will only get worse. So joining us now with more reaction to this is Lara Brown, political scientist and also author of the forthcoming book, Jefferson's Landmark Deal, The Politics of the Louisiana Purchase. Lara, welcome back to Balance of Power. We should point out that Haley Stevens is not a socialist and Abdul El-Sayed is not a communist, though he is notably further left than Stevens was, and he's now going to be the general election candidate. How steep is his uphill climb if he wants to beat Mike Rogers?
Well, I think there's an overemphasis on sort of the difference between these candidates and what the fall campaign is going to shape up to be about. Because at the end of the day, what we have is a president with historically poor approval ratings, and there is a high disapproval level in Michigan. And so it's going to be a race really between the Democratic senatorial candidate and the Republican senatorial candidate. It is not necessarily going to be a discussion about the finite policy differences within or among Democrats. And let me just say, sort of at the outset, we are in a completely normal cycle. When parties lose a presidency, they spend the next midterm cycle essentially having factional disputes and contests where their different ideological wings are looking to gain prominence. And what you'll see is that this debate over which direction the Democratic Party goes in won't be settled until they choose a presidential nominee in 2028.
Well, so who's leading in that internal contest? Lara Brown, we see William Lawrence last evening, founder of the Sunrise Movement, defeating two moderate candidates. This is still in Michigan. This is the 7th district to compete with Congressman Tom Barrett in the general election. Then again, we saw Representative Wesley Bell beat Cori Bush again. Is there actually a narrative here, or is this something that the media is trying to connect the dots on?
I actually don't think there is a narrative. I think what we are going to see is a lot of candidates appealing to local concerns. And the one major concern out there is the economy, and people are feeling the pinch of higher gas prices. They are displeased with the inflation rate. You also have the issue of the war. And certainly for those in Michigan, tariffs on Canada have been a blow to their economy. So there are a lot of reasons to reject essentially the president's party and his candidates. You also have a gubernatorial candidate in Jocelyn Benson, who won a very large, Democratic primary race. And she is going to be sort of campaigning statewide at the same time that El-Sayed is. And I think what you'll see is how much they are able to galvanize the Michigan Democratic Party and those independents displeased with the Trump administration to push them over the top.
Mm-hmm. Well, so when we consider then where those independents are going to go, Lara, I wonder how you view the available share of votes. This is a conversation we were having in 2024 as well. How is it shaping up in 2026 as we consider the ultimate balance of congressional power?
Well, I think what we have to do is look back at an analog. 2006 looks a lot like what we are seeing. A historically unpopular president, an unpopular war, issues of personal scandals, and also public corruption. All of those things are kind of combining to have the Democrats with a solid, north of 6 percentage point advantage on the generic ballot, and a very large disapproval rating of the president, which puts him on the ballot even though he is not.
I'd like to ask you about something that's taking place here in Washington among members already elected. We heard from Chuck Edwards in the middle of the night. Lara, it was about 3:30 in the morning, the Republican from North Carolina announcing he's dropping his re-election bid following a House Ethics Committee report that recommended he be censured. There's still a huge question over Max Miller, and I'm wondering your thoughts on this, because the congressman is pointing to Speaker Johnson and the president, saying nobody's asked me to bow out over what are very serious domestic abuse allegations. We know that the speaker has a very thin margin to protect, but I'm wondering your thoughts on how this might resolve. Does Max Miller need to step down on his own or be forced out?
So, having written both a dissertation on congressional scandals and published subsequently on sex scandals, I can tell you that really what is happening and what has always happened is that partisans rally around their tainted member. And it's very rare that they push them out. And the only time that they really do is when they think that that reputational taint will in fact sort of infect the rest of the party brand. So the real question is, how high a profile do these allegations against Max Miller continue to become, and whether or not Johnson feels that it is now important for him to distance his conference from this representative. We saw this obviously with the Democrats, with issues that they had. So it is a question of how bad does it look, not necessarily how bad are the allegations.
Mm-hmm.
It's also striking to consider that it's not just about his House seat or the House.
Yes.
There's also a gubernatorial race and a Senate race in Ohio in which Republicans may be concerned about the blowback as well.
Yeah, this is quite a story.
That's right.
Lara
And
Brown,
just
it's great
going
to have
back
you
to 2006.
Yeah, 30 seconds, Lara.
Sure. If you look at 2006, we saw both Tom DeLay and Bob Ney run for their primaries, win their primaries, and then resign before the general elections because both had corruption issues with then lobbyist Jack Abramoff.
Tom DeLay reference. We're hitting it all today. Lara Brown, thank you so much. It's great to see you. Political scientist. The book again, Jefferson's Landmark Deal. This is Bloomberg.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. Little change on the S&P 500 index, higher by just about 1 point. If we close higher for both the Dow and the S&P, that will be a new record. The Dow, by the way, up 432 points right now, up another 0.8%, building on yesterday's surge. S&P, little changed on the day, but higher NASDAQ trading down 0.4%. NASDAQ 100 index down 0.3%. The SOX, which is the Philadelphia Stock Exchange Semiconductor Index, it is down by 0.5%. Advanced Micro Devices after earnings weighing on the index down 6.2%. 2-year at 4.19% with a 10-year currently yielding 4.61% and the 30-year 5.16%. Gold is surging 3.9%. Spot gold now at $42.37 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude $74.53 a barrel. WTI down 1.6%. Barrel of Brent, $78.80, down 0.7%. This is Traders Digest, the latest headlines out of the Middle East. Eli Lilly has boosted its 2026 sales guidance after its weight loss drugs performed far better than expected in the second quarter. Lilly shares, they're gaining now by 3.7%. Yesterday, we heard from both Merck and Pfizer. Both companies higher again today. Merck up 0.5%, Pfizer up by 0.1%. SpaceX, after earnings, now down by 10.6%. Recapping, S&P just turning negative, little change, down 2 points, down under 0.1%. Joe and Kailey, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us on Bloomberg TV and radio for this Wednesday edition of Balance of Power. It's also the day after edition of Tuesday's primaries, and in Michigan specifically, where so many people were focused for a directional cue as to where the Democratic Party is going in this midterm cycle and beyond. It's unclear whether they got a clear narrative in the outcome of the Michigan senatorial primary, because yes, Abdul al-Sayed, who of course is the more progressive candidate who was in the race, did best. The Congresswoman Haley Stevens, seen as more of a moderate, but it was tight. We're talking about a 1% difference as the votes were all counted. Al-Sayed, of course, being more progressive, being described by President Trump today as a communist, which he is not, but he did run on a very consistent message. If you're not like us here on Balance of Power, having to listen to all the politics podcasts and having to watch all the advertisements, he basically said three things over and over and over again. Money out of politics, money in your pocket, Medicare for all. And he actually joined this program last year. It was May 2025, in which he talked about that notion of getting money out of politics and getting corporate contributions out of politics specifically. Listen.
The big difference with me is just that I don't take corporate contributions for a reason, because I think that Donald Trump is actually just the symptom of a far bigger disease. And that disease is the politics that have been dominated by corporate interests and frankly, the interests of billionaires. And I think that has led us to a system where the economy doesn't work for working people, where we can't guarantee people health care, where our air, water, and soil get corrupted by the interests of a few very, very large corporations. I think we can do better.
Indeed, more than $50 million was spent on behalf of Haley Stevens in this campaign. AIPAC put up a lot of that money, as did the establishment Democratic Party here in Washington. We assembled our political panel to do some forensic investigating on how this all happened and why it was so close. Bloomberg Politics contributors Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis are with us. Jeanne is our Democratic analyst, democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Rick is a partner at Stonecourt Capital and our Republican strategist. And Jeanne, I'll start with you here. Your thoughts on this. If you read the tip sheets this morning, you can find a couple saying this was a huge night for progressives in the state of Michigan and around the country. Others said it was a terrible night because he only won by 1 point. How should we be looking at this?
Yeah, and I think a lot of that had to do with expectations, you know, and I say this with a lot of love to all my friends who are pollsters. I'm a pollster myself, but the polls by and large were way, way off. I mean, showing huge double-digit leads for al-Sayed. And of course, it was nothing like that. And we didn't even know till this morning who had been named the winner. So, you know, I think a lot of that had to do with expectations, because if we take a step back, and last year when he was on Balance of Power, and he was talking, I think none of us would have said that he would have had a chance to become the nominee of the Democratic Party in Michigan, given how progressive he has been described and how progressive he describes himself. So this is a big win for progressives. And of course, it wasn't just al-Sayed. You had other wins for progressives in Michigan as well. So all in all, a big night for progressives. But of course, that said, he's got a ton of work to do starting this morning if he is going to beat Mike Rogers. And that is going to be an uphill battle in a state as moderate and purple and swingy as Michigan.
Well, if there is a lot of work to do, Rick, one would think that that means there's a lot of money to be spent. But have we learned a bit of a lesson here around the efficacy of money? As Joe mentioned, the money was on the side of Haley Stevens here, and she did not come out victorious.
Yeah, Haley Stevens and company spent, 10 times more than El Sayed even raised. So it was a real referendum on the fact that money doesn't buy votes. But that being said, it was a lot closer, as Jeanne said. We both predicted yesterday that you can't watch Michigan polling because it's notoriously bad. Well, we were proven right, and feel good about that. But look, I mean, this is a migration of the Democratic Party, just like there's a migration to the right on the Republican Party. I mean, like, it's undeniable. There's a movement to the left, and the Republicans are moving toward the right. That's why we have this thing called MAGA. And so this is just a natural occurrence, and we're going to see it play out in other states. But at the end of the day, the question is, can El Sayed win a statewide race? And when you look at the number of things that are happening on the ground in these elections, and there were a bunch yesterday on referendums that show large blue participation in the elections, and that should send shockwaves up Republicans right now, because when you got races like in Texas where Trump won by 14% and it's a dead heat in the Senate, you better start sweating bullets.
Wow. Well, you know, I'd offer what happened in Missouri last evening as well, Jeanne. This was a rematch between Representative Wesley Bell and Cori Bush, who was coming back in an attempt to return to Congress. AIPAC put $2 million into Bell's reelection campaign, and Wesley Bell won again. Is the national trend to go left or to simply be more involved?
You know, I think we're seeing, it depends on the district. It depends on the state. And of course, I just want to underscore, candidates matter an awful lot. Yeah. And so you're absolutely right. Bell nominated again by his party to hold his seat if he can. You know, on the Michigan side, you see somebody like El Sayed versus a candidate in Haley Stevens, who for all her gifts was unable to translate that, her establishment support and her money, into a win there. And I think this is the challenge that Republicans face, in addition to the historical wave that we will likely see that's turning blue, and to the enthusiasm Rick was talking about on the Democratic side. It's also the issue of Rogers himself as a candidate. We heard today El Sayed say, come on, let's have 5 debates. I want an answer today. As far as I know, Rogers hasn't answered. He's talking about Rogers living in Florida. Rogers had a really strange interview with Semaphore the other day, when after repeated questions about national issues, he kept deferring and saying, oh, no, I don't want to talk about that. This is a local race. Well, he's not running for mayor. He's running for senator. And this is a guy with foreign policy chops. And is he going to hug Donald Trump or move away from him? He was bested by Kash Patel to be FBI director for Donald Trump this time around. Hard to run away from that. So all of these things make it really difficult for Rogers in a time when we're seeing this blue wave. But of course, they're going to try to paint El Sayed as this communist, socialist, very left-wing figure. And based on what I heard today when he came out, he's going to push back hard on those suggestions and try to get Democrats who he lost to Stevens on board with him. So it's going to be quite a race. But I don't think we're seeing one direction or another for Democrats. It depends on the state and the district and where voters find themselves.
Well, understanding that this may be a state-by-state case as we look toward November, Rick, when we consider the path, the narrow one that Democrats have to try to get the Senate majority, is there any realistic path that does not include retaining a blue seat in Michigan? Do you see a world in which they could maybe lose Michigan but would pick up the other 5 necessary to flip the chamber?
I think it's very hard. I think they've got to retain that seat. I think that you could make some kind of an academic argument based on the cycle, based on the energy, things like that, that they could pick up for. But finding that fifth seat, if they had to, would be incredibly difficult. And I would say the one thing I would disagree with Jeanne a little bit on, and I'm giving the Democrats more credit than they probably deserve, is I think this is a national thing. I don't think this is state by state. I think what you see happening in Michigan, same thing is happening in places like Missouri and Kansas and Texas and Ohio and places like that, where Democrats are totally overperforming Harris on the ballot, and Republicans are well underperforming Trump from the 2024 ballot. And that is an elixir for a national movement. And if this gets caught up in that, then anything goes. But I think the Democrats have to look at this Michigan seat and say, we have to go all in on El-Sayed. We have to make sure he wins. We have a vulnerable Republican who lost by 2% in a good year for Republicans. Now it's a bad year for Republicans. We ought to be able to beat the guy. So we'll see. I mean, it'll be interesting to see if El-Sayed cooperates with that and moves to the center a little bit.
Well, if we pull out the lens here a bit, Democrats are feeling pretty good about things, it seems, Jeanne. As I look at the latest from the DCCC, this is, of course, the campaign committee that gets Democrats elected to the House. 90 days out from the midterms, it says, DTRIP announces latest expansion of the House battlefield for the cycle. They've added 12 more names to make a total of 58 as Democrats go on offense. I've got to be honest, though, some of these names you wouldn't expect to see on a list like this, Jeanne. Lauren Boebert, Victoria Spartz, okay. But French Hill, the chairman of House Financial Services from Arkansas, Mike Flood of Nebraska, Nick LaLota of New York, these are all flippable?
You know, I don't think all of them are, but I do think it is a sign that Democrats understand the environment they are in. And if it hadn't been for the mid-decade redistricting, if it's not for these threats from Donald Trump about muddying the waters with voters lists and other things, then they should have a huge pickup this year. Given the president's numbers on the economy alone, you know, you look back, a president who is at 37, 38% overall, and approval on the economy, 32, 33, 34, depending on the polls. It's very hard for his party to do well. But given, as I mentioned, the way these districts look, it might be a little tougher than it has been in the past. But Joe, Rick Davis and the DCCC feeling good about the Democrats. So I'm in a good mood.
Rick Davis, our Republican strategist, and Jeanne Zaino, our Democratic analyst on today's political panel. Thank you both so much for joining us on Balance of Power. We'll turn back to geopolitics ahead as former Ambassador Barbara Leaf, our former Assistant Secretary of State, joins us next on Bloomberg.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. The Dow, the S&P, they're both gaining right now. Stocks are wavering near records. Any advance today for both the Dow and the S&P will be a new high. We've got NASDAQ, the NASDAQ 100 index, and the Russell 2000 all trading lower. Right now, the S&P is up 6 points, has been fluctuating between gains and losses. 77.42 where we stand on the S&P, up under 0.1%. The Dow, though, up almost 500 points. That's on top of yesterday's surge. Right now, the Dow is up by 0.9%. The SOX, the Philadelphia Stock Exchange Semiconductor Index, down now by 0.4%. AMD, after earnings, it is down by 6.2%, weighing on the SOX. The two-year yield currently 4.18%, the 10-year 4.61%, and the 30-year 5.16%. The VIX, by the way, Wall Street's so-called fear gauge, back below 16 right now. Spot gold trading higher by $172 the ounce to $42.50, up 4.2%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.6%, $74.59 a barrel. Brent $78.83 barrel of Brent down 0.6%. This as Iran says it has reached an agreement with Oman on a proposed route for shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. It's seen as a potential step toward a reopening of the critical waterway for energy supplies. Again, WTI crude $74.66 a barrel, down 1.5%. Earnings news. We heard from the Walt Disney Company this morning. Shares up today by 3.6%. Profit beating Wall Street estimates. Paramount Skydance reported last night. Shares of Paramount Skydance, right now they are up by 4.6%. Paramount, of course, seeking to acquire rival entertainment giant Warner Brothers Discovery. WBD up by under 0.1%. Recapping. S&P pushing higher, trading at a record right now, up 4 points, up 0.1%. Joe and Kailey, that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you. Charlie Pellet will be back in about 20 minutes' time, top of the hour, 2 p.m. Eastern, as we dig into Bloomberg Business Week Daily with the latest on stocks. Nice to see things perking higher a little bit, and curious to see the reaction in the oil market with so much uncertainty over these deals that are purportedly on the way between Iran, Oman, and possibly the U.S. I'll remind everyone, though, Kailey Leinz, it was 1 week ago today that the Dow Industrial Average was down over 1,000 points right now. The 30-year bond was yielding 5.2%. Situational awareness was in the air, and we were supposed to be at the end of a bull market. How things have changed.
Yeah, of course, there was the pressure upward on rates because of the Fed and concern that they were going to let inflation get out of control, because Kevin Warsh, of course, didn't deliver the strongest of press conferences in the mind of the markets. But a lot of the concern around inflation is because of the fact that energy prices were once again ascendant because of escalation between the U.S. and Iran. We've seen energy prices moving down significantly if you take a look at crude oil, as there, at least for now, seems to be a pause as they do pursue this diplomatic effort. It's just unclear who's talking to whom and whether a deal that the U.S. is involved in really is in the offing.
Well, that's just it. I mean, we do this all day, every day, and following the headlines has become extremely difficult to understand where they're coming from and what is motivating them. We've got three parties here, the United States and Iran. We knew we're talking. Oman has now entered the picture and apparently will have either a separate deal with Iran or a three-way deal involving all three countries to control traffic in the Strait. The president, though, was speaking optimistically about a deal with Tehran as recently as last evening as he spoke with reporters on the tarmac out west. Listen.
A lot of progress has been made. And they called me and they said, please, let's talk. I think it'd be very smart to make a deal. They had a very good day. The negotiations were good. The stock market was up tremendously over the last 3-4 days. We're moving along very nicely. We'll find out. We'll know in 48 hours.
So I guess we'll see what we do know in 48 hours. What we know for the time being, at least from the Iranian side, is that they do think they have a deal. It's just with Oman over routes of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. So joining us now for more on this is Ambassador Barbara Leaf, the former ambassador to the UAE and former Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs during the Biden administration. She's now Distinguished Diplomatic Fellow at the Middle East Institute. Ambassador, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. Terry Haynes of Pangea Policy, a voice that's often heard here on Bloomberg TV and radio, writes in a note, there's one big reason Hormuz almost certainly isn't going to reopen just because Iran and Oman make a deal. Iran and Oman aren't exclusively able to make any deal that sticks. Hormuz is international waters governed by a UN treaty that doesn't change because a couple of countries decide otherwise. Is he right?
Well, Kailey, that may be legally speaking true, but we're not really dealing with legalities at this point. We're dealing with hard power politics. And the fact is the deal that the Omanis are closing in on with Iran is being conveyed. The details of those are being conveyed throughout the GCC to gain the collective support of those countries, as well as back to Washington. So I am hearing that indeed they are very close, that it will be a 60-day deal with one option for renewal, and that the terms of the deal are really to just arrive at more durable arrangements for the Strait of Hormuz. In other words, this is not about the nuclear deal or the nuclear program at all. No fees, but as you're seeing in the press, some division of responsibilities that are not entirely, shall we say, 50-50.
What about the Red Sea then? I'm getting confused. So we get 3 lanes of travel and some sort of toll booth eventually in the Strait of Hormuz. Houthis are still threatening shipping in the Red Sea, and we've seen it impact oil prices already. The group most recently, just in the last 24 hours, promising to escalate attacks on Saudi vessels in the northern Red Sea. Is this going to be a game of whack-a-mole, trying to keep waterways
Joe, you're
open?
right. You're right that there is an added volatility to the larger situation for the world economy, where the Red Sea and the Houthi in particular are concerned. So there has been no deal struck, or to my knowledge, even being really dealt with at this point. There's a lot of threat making on the part of the Houthi, and they do, of course, have some capabilities that are extraordinary to disrupt not just maritime traffic, but indeed to target Saudi energy infrastructure.
Well, and of course, it is concern over the idea that infrastructure could be targeted in retaliation for U.S. escalation against Iran, that we understand is what the Gulf allies expressed to President Trump and got him to pull back and give Iran this one last chance, as he described it. Ambassador, do you believe, A, that this really is the last chance, that Iran believes that, or do you believe ultimately that there will have to be further escalation if this is ultimately to resolve at any point?
No, I never believe that, the verbiage of one last chance or one last round of diplomacy or one last round of military operations. There's no deal until there is a deal. And this emerging deal on the Strait of Hormuz will simply reset the table for a more detailed set of discussions and arrangements. And I would hope to see at that point that American negotiators would actually be at that table. But no, there's no last and final.
One of the scarier headlines that we talked about yesterday came from Reuters. The U.S. Army has used up virtually all of its long-range missiles. We're out of ATACMS. If I know that, certainly Iran knows that. Does this goad the regime to try to wait us out even longer?
So, Joe, I think there's so many factors that weigh or that come into play on the regime's high levels of confidence, probably overconfidence, but still they assess the president's impatience. They assess the president's threat making being pretty hollow at this point. Yes, they do read, of course, all of the open information about the straitened circumstances of our missile defense arsenal, our munitions of various type, high-end munitions. And they certainly look at the president's political clock, which is to say the onrushing elections in November.
And the president consistently maintains that he doesn't care about that clock. He doesn't care about the midterms, as he said, perhaps now, famously, Ambassador. But as we consider the looming midterms in November, and what you just said is there is no real last chance or last escalation, that nothing is final until there is a final deal. Do you expect we could be at that point by November?
I think it's going to be exceptionally difficult, but possible to arrive at some more durable arrangements for the Strait that won't be entirely to our liking by any means, that will be a stepping stone to a more durable negotiated end to the war itself. But I don't think that will be complete, because assuming that the president still wants a negotiated set of terms on the nuclear program, that will certainly not be done by November. And I'd be surprised, frankly, if that discussion is even begun.
Well, there's a lot to be said there. And when you sort of look at this since it began, we're walking up, I guess, on 6 months at this point, which is pretty remarkable to think. And you sort of stretch this out into a series of events. How would you describe the inflection points? We've had a series of on-again, off-again bouts of fighting, on-again, off-again negotiations. But frankly, nothing has really changed since this began, other than destroying some of, if not most of, Iran's military assets and creating a new leverage point for Tehran. Am I missing anything here?
Well, Joe, I think the way I look at it is there were some really key inflection points in the first several weeks of the war, indeed in the first week. And every passing week, and certainly every passing month, has gotten worse in terms of U.S. deterrence, credibility, and the power and punch of the president's own language. So there's no time like the present to get on with the negotiations and do at the table what the administration has avoided doing to date, which is recognize that there are limits to what the military tools can bring you, and at a certain point you have to get to the negotiating table and really do some hard driving. And it's not as if we don't have leverage, carrots and sticks, but we've been far too stick-minded rather than thinking about the inducements for a better set of terms with the Iranians, notwithstanding the fact that you've got a much more radicalized regime, and that again was an inflection point from the first week of the war.
Well, as we consider diplomacy then here, Ambassador, how materially different would the negotiations potentially be if it were a different set of negotiators at the table on behalf of the United States? Is Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner still the best team for this job as they kind of were negotiating from the onset, or would a switch up potentially benefit the situation?
So I'm a firm believer that you can put a variety of different principles at the table, but they must be backed by a cohort of real deep expertise, legal, technical, in terms of both maritime security, the regional dimension, and so forth. I think the team has struggled with a set of misconceptions about the difference between doing real estate deals, no matter how complex, how torturous, difference between that kind of deal and a negotiation to arrive at a political set of arrangements. It's apples and oranges, or as the Brits would say, chalk and cheese. They are so fundamentally different. And I don't think they have appreciated that all the way up until now.
Is Iran waiting for the next administration?
No, the Iranians aren't waiting for 2+ years, but they do believe that they've got a better situation sitting where they are and waiting out certainly until November. They don't have an indefinite amount of string to play out here in terms of their own economic problems at home, but they definitely feel that the pressure is rising on the U.S. side faster than it is on their side of the table. Since they don't have to stand for elections, they don't really have to countenance what the public wants. They have massive tools of repression to use against the public.
It's great to have you back with us, former Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs in the Biden administration, now with the Middle East Institute. Barbara Leaf, great to have you with us, as always. I'm Joe Mathieu, alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. As we round out the early edition of Balance of Power here, we'll meet you back at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll check how the markets wrap things up, and after the bell, earnings. It's been a little uneven so far today, Kailey. We came out of the box pretty strong this morning. People feeling pretty good about incredibly powerful earnings and an all-time high for the S&P. We're still in record high territory, but the S&P only up 3 points in the middle of the session here.
Yeah, with a little bit of underperformance for tech stocks, as the NASDAQ 100 is actually down by a little bit. So we'll get into how things shook out at the close in our late edition, and also recap, or potentially still be in, the remarks of President Trump as he's set to speak in Las Vegas, Nevada. So we'll see you then at 5 p.m. Eastern. In the meantime, Bloomberg Business Week Daily is just ahead right here on Bloomberg TV and radio.